Hi folks, welcome to part 2 of Your Backyard. I'm Bill Vales and I'm here on the Yapp Property, which we started our hike into here off of Newtown Road. To my right is Fort Rock, which is where we ended the previous show. And now we're going to get us out of where we are, but first we're going to venture down to Cobb Trail and see what we find down there. Well, we're walking by Fort Rock, heading towards the Cobb Trail, and I'm walking through a break in the stone wall here. There's stone walls that go all through the properties here, and as the land was farmed, rocks were cleared and moved into walls. The trail here is a bit narrower than we were on, still very pleasant. I'm down here in one of the several vernal pools that you can find on the Yapp property. We're actually, I'm not sure technically if this is the Yapp property or the Cobb Trail that we're on, because we're approaching a point of intersection soon. But this vernal pool, it's clearly dry right now, but it's a bit mucky. There's some very interesting things that I want to call to your attention down here. Among the vegetation are a variety of fern species down here. And I don't know if you remember, but about a year ago on one of the sessions on Your Backyard at Long Lake, we were talking about ferns, and I told you I was going to study up on ferns. Well, I've studied up on ferns. Don't know everything, but I know more than I did when I shot that. And one of the ferns that we have here, you'll see that these ferns, there's some that are still green, and there's some that have died and turned brown, and we'll show you some of those later. A fern is not necessarily associated with a swamp or wet environment. Some ferns like wet environments. Some ferns like dry environments. Some ferns like environments that have a bit of lime, perhaps sweet soil environment. So the type of fern species that you'll get in any given area is really dependent on the environment. So don't broad brush ferns to think that they only are in swampy environments. Some of the anatomy of a fern. Ferns are going to grow, they come out of the ground. No big surprise there, right? They come out of the ground, and what's underneath the ground is what's called the rhizome. And a rhizome is not unique to a fern. Lots of plants have rhizomes. You can think of it as your main root ball that's in the ground, and the fern comes up. And the fern you have from coming up to here, you have what's called the frond, and also referred to as the blade of the fern. Now, some of the characteristics of a fern is how high the fern gets, the color of the fern, the arrangement of the pinnae, which are the leaves that come off the frond. Okay, and then off a particular pinnae, you get pinna, which are the individual leaves, if you will, that come off the pinnae. And there are various varieties. We're going to look at a couple varieties. And that's Fern 101. Okay. This fern here is what's called a wood fern. And I can tell this is a wood fern because on the lower part of the rachis, or the shaft down here, on the lower part of it, there's some woody scales, okay? And these woody scales are indicative of a wood fern. And a wood fern is actually a large variety of ferns. There's several different species that fall in the category of wood fern, but for this part of the show, we're going to just consider this to be the wood fern. And I don't know if here, this one is okay. So we're going to look out for other ferns, and I'm going to identify them as we see them. Ferns are some of our oldest plants. Again, these go back to the Carboniferous period, and the way that ferns reproduce are through spores. And different species of ferns have their spores located on different places. On this particular wood fern here, if we look at the back of the fern, various pinnae, you can see small brown dots on the back. Now that is not a diseased plant. That's a very healthy plant, and those are the spores that the fern is going to use to reproduce. Now a certain time each year, these spores will break open, and what's in the spores will be dispersed, and eventually that will fall on a receptacle that will reproduce. And the receptacle may be on actually on the same plant, or it may be on a different plant. But the spores here are how it reproduces. Now, some ferns will reproduce via rhizome extension, where the root ball under the ground will grow up new ferns. But the primary way of reproduction in a fern is through spores. The spores will disperse. And you'll see as we go through as we find different ferns, and I found around here maybe 10 different species of ferns, which I thought was pretty neat. But these spores will disperse. So, fern reproduction. Well, there's some interesting things that we're going to talk about here. First off, on this black birch, I'd like to point out to you some beautiful examples of turkey tail mushrooms. And these are quite attractive to look at. Something in helping you to identify mushrooms is looking on the underside of them. The underside of these mushrooms shows you how the spores are arranged. But these are turkey tails, which are kind of nice. I don't need to explain why they're called turkey tails, but you can see some smaller ones up here growing up. Oh, and I didn't even have to bend down because there's some above my head here. It gives me a good sense of what's going on underneath. Very interesting. Now, here we have two young trees side by side. And these leaves are quite close in the way they look, but they're different. And let's look at a couple of the differences here. This leaf here, very smooth edge. Very smooth edge to it. See the veining on the back? Did that acorn get you? No. Okay. The bark here is very smooth. Now, you have to be very careful about bark, because bark will change its appearance as the tree grows. So a young tree may have a very smooth bark, and as the tree grows, the bark may get a little more scaled, a little more mottled, and things about it will change. But this very young tree has a smooth bark, has a smooth edge leaf that's ovoid in shape. This tree here has a bark that's somewhat mottled, a little bit mottled. It has an oval leaf, but there is a difference in this leaf and this leaf. This leaf, you'll note on the edge, has this wave-like pattern to it, and that's a differentiating factor right to my eye between these two. This tree here is a American chestnut tree. Now it's not going to last very long because those all died off as a result of the chestnut blight back around the turn of the previous century, 1900. The chestnut trees tend to grow to 20, 30, maybe 40 feet high, and then they will succumb to the blight. But they're not extinct. Okay, you can still find them growing out of stumps. I'm sure if I dug around here, I would find a chestnut stump, but that's what this is. And that's a young American beech, and here's an older, fine example of an American beech, which is right here. Nice smooth bark. Okay, so it maintained the smooth bark in a tree this size. How big is this? I can pretty much hug it, so however big that is. And very smooth bark. No one has carved in it yet, which is great, so no young lovers have found this beech tree to carve their initials and hearts in it, which has been part of the curse of the American beech tree. This is a beautiful tree. Well, here we are. We're going to cross the vernal pool on a lovely footbridge. I really like footbridges. They give you a little bit of elevation, which allows you to see a little more. This particular footbridge is maintained by the Littleton Conservation Trust. There's a tag right here, installed and maintained by the Littleton Conservation Trust. It's a nice bridge. Actually, from the vernal pool here, we're probably 2.5 feet up. Springtime, if we get some water back in our aquifers, I hope to see this running. There's a lot of ferns over here. I wonder what kind of ferns these are. Fern madness now. Been unleashed. Lots of spores on the back. Oh, these are scaled. So these are in the woodland wood fern variety. Okay. Nice footbridge. Oh, what a different type of fern this is. What type of fern is this? I'm not sure, but this is a different type of fern. I'm not sure what type of fern this is, but this is different, and I can't say that I've seen one of these, but looking at the pinna, okay, there's no cutting of it. It's very smooth, very smooth. I don't see any spores on this, but different species have their spores in different locations. This is heavily veined on the back, heavily veined, which I'll make a note of that for when I go to try to research this further. This is definitely not a wood fern. The pinna looks different. The color is different. It's lighter. The shape of the pinna. Very interesting. Good. Another project. Grab a piece for science. Figure out what we have. Well, we have some more dead ferns here. I want to okay, there's no odor to that. Now what I'm doing here is I want to see if this is the species of fern called a Hey Scented Fern. And the Hey Scented Fern has the characteristic of, after they die, succumb to the frost, crumble them up. Should smell like hay. This does not smell like hay, so it's not a hay scented fern. Not quite sure what it is, but we're in search of the hay scented fern. Well, on the edge of the vernal pool, we all know that in front here we have a young white oak tree with the rounded leaf lobe here. But what's behind it here? Do we remember what this leaf is? Shaped like a mitten. This is the sassafras leaf. Okay, this is a young sassafras tree, and that's a sassafras leaf. What a neat leaf. I think sassafras trees were used to make root beer. This is a pretty large American beech tree. I must confess I've been looking for beech trees around here that have various initials in them, carved in them. There's one beech tree that apparently has a date carved into it of I want to say it's 07, but thereabouts. And I think the initials are GW, but they may be something else that applies to a former owner of the property. So whenever I see an American beech tree around here, I am looking for initials in them. One thing I wanted to point out, which I mentioned on the black birch tree, was the lenticels, the horizontal lines that are on the bark. Now, lenticels are not unique to birch trees. Other trees have the need to exchange gases with the environment, and you can see on this beech tree here, you have some lenticels. Okay. So this is not indicative of a diseased tree or anything like that. Perfectly healthy, fine-looking tree. Here's some more scars here. Tree's in beautiful shape. Looks great. Underneath this large, what looks like a red oak, is a younger hemlock tree. And I wanted to use this opportunity to talk a little bit about how one might identify a hemlock tree versus a spruce tree versus a white pine tree, red pine, red spruce, and other conifer varieties. Now, remember, conifers, the main categories of the trees that we have are deciduous and conifers. And deciduous trees tend to shed their leaves once a year and grow them back in springtime. Conifer trees, on the other hand, hold their leaves, if you will. Actually, they hold their needles, would be more accurate to say. Now, they don't hold their needles all the time, but I'll get back to that in a second. But on this hemlock tree, what I wanted to point out here is that how would you determine the difference between a hemlock and a spruce if you didn't know what other characteristics of the tree? I happen to know this is a hemlock tree just because of the habit of it, and by the habit I mean the stature of it, the shape it takes. However, if you didn't know that and you were to look at the needles on this tree, you would find on the hemlock the needles are fairly soft. You run your hands over them or handshake the tree. They're fairly soft. They're short in terms of coming off the stem. They're short and they're flat. If you look or feel these needles, they're flat. Needles on some spruce or balsam fir will tend to be rounded, and some will even tend to be squared depending on the species of them. But if you turn these needles over on the hemlock, you'll notice there's a white stripe. White stripe. And that's really indicative of a hemlock tree. So all those things together make this a hemlock tree. Short needles, stripe on the back, needles are flat, the overall habit of the tree. This is hemlock. Okay, and it's a young hemlock tree. Now, I have a white pine tree here. And a white pine has the characteristics. Actually, white pines will shed their needles every 2 or 3 years. I mean, you look around, look at all the white pine needles here. They don't shed all their needles and the trees wind up bare, but every couple years, white pine will shed its needles. Okay, so the white pine needles grow in a bundle, and in each bundle is 5 needles. And I've peeled a bundle off from this white pine, and there are the 5 needles in that bundle. Well, we're coming to the end of the Cobb Trail. I can see houses here, but over here to the left, look what we have. Another species of fern. And what this fern is, this is a bracken fern. And I can tell this is a bracken fern because it tends to branch out 3 ways. 1, 2, 3. And that's what this is. The pinna is a different shape. If you compared it to the wood fern or any other fern, it's not as ornate, but this is a bracken fern. And the root ball, or the main rhizome of the bracken fern, can be down as far as 10 feet, 10, 15 feet in the ground, sending off rhizomes throughout. These survive very nicely. And they're quite prolific. And it's interesting that here I see 1 bracken fern. I don't see any others. But this branching of 3 is indicative of what it is. So that's a nice surprise. I was just scolded by my executive director. I must have forgot that we were doing TV here, but I was really focused on some other things. And there, this bracken fern is a real nice looking mushroom. Now, I'm not sure of the type of mushroom it is, but I can tell you this. I don't eat any mushrooms. I know some are okay to eat, and I know some will kill you real quick. But this is a nice looking mushroom, and if we had a mirror, we could look at the spores on the other side. And actually what people do to help with their identification, they take a certain type of paper and they put the mushroom on the paper. They'll cut it, put the mushroom on the paper, and on the paper you'll get a fingerprint, if you will, of what the underside of the mushroom looks like. And that's a good aid in identification. Mushroom ID I need to work on, but this past year was ferns, and we're working on mushrooms too. Well, that's it for this segment of Your Backyard. We're going to end this segment at the end of the Yapp Trail where it intersects the Cobb Trail. We hope you found this segment informative, and we'll see you next time on Your Backyard.